Hi, my name is Tuba Tanyeri Erdemir, and I am the coordinator of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. Welcome to Past and Future of Christianity in the Middle East webinar. At this time, I would like to introduce ADL's Senior Vice President for Public Affairs, Chief of Staff, and Co-Chair of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities, George Selim.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tuba. And thank you all for joining us on this critical webinar this morning. Since its establishment in 1913, the ADL has been committed to its timeless mission of stopping the defamation of the Jewish people and securing justice and fair treatment to all. Consistent with its founding mission in 2018, ADL launched its task force on Middle East minorities with the mission of educating, advocating, and elevating issues that are impacting often overlooked communities across the Middle East, to include religious, ethnic, sexual, and gender minorities, and others who face governmental and societal repression and discrimination. This task is even more important at this critical time when extremism is really on the rise globally, and threats to vulnerable communities is more pronounced than ever in the Middle East. Christianity was born in the Middle East. Yet, after centuries of war, expulsions, and genocide, the persecutions made Christian communities minorities in the region. ISIS's targeting and persecution of Christians over the last decade had an extremely traumatic effect on Christianity in the Middle East. Discriminatory practices and authoritarian governments and other non-state entities further increased the vulnerability of Christian communities. In today's webinar, we bring together experts and human rights advocates to discuss the current challenges and existential threats to Middle Eastern Christian communities, and more importantly, how to overcome them. Let me introduce our panel today. First, let me start with Shadi Martini, Chief Executive Officer of the Multifaith Alliance and co-chair of ADL's Middle East Minorities Task Force. With that, Shadi, over to you.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Tuba, and thank you, ADL, for organizing this important webinar. I want to start by introducing our distinguished panelist. Nadine Maenza is the president of the IRF Secretariat, a global fellow at the Wilson Center, and a former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I always see her as a frequent traveler to the Middle East. Johnnie is the president of the Congress of Christian Leaders and a former member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's also a member of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities and also a frequent traveler all over the Middle East and Africa. Sam Tadros is an independent researcher and scholar, Middle East expert, ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities, and also born and raised in the Middle East like me. We are honored to have you with us today to join in our discussion of the existential threat that Christian communities are facing across the Middle East. This webinar is part of the Task Force annual theme of 2024, Fighting Extinction, reversing the trend of the Middle East at-risk minorities. I want to start with you, Sam, since you're also a fellow Middle Easterner like me. Would you please tell us about the factors that caused this exodus of Christian communities across the Middle East? Can you tell us about the action of state and non-state actors that endangers the life of Christians in the region? What are some of the systematic persecution and discriminatory practices that make them more vulnerable?
Thank you, Shadi. That's a lot to discuss.
I know we bombard you with a lot of things.
Thank you, ADL, and thank you, Shadi, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. I think there are a lot of factors that are driving Christians outside of the Middle East. Historically, of course, Christianity has went through periods of persecution and discrimination. Things were never completely rosy. But I think that the key factors to look at explaining why today is different from the past is simply the openness of the outside world. and of course the change in technology and the world that we live in. By this, I mean that in the past, when being persecuted, you simply resorted to geography. Minorities, whether it was Christians or other communities, the Kurds, the Yazidis, simply escaped to the mountains. It was the geography that played the most important role in protecting those communities from complete extinction. This is not available today with modern weaponry and so on. The ISIS savagery, the ISIS targeting of the Yazidis, for example, the Christians and others, could not be stopped outside of the intervention of the United States and other allied countries in using their air forces to stop them. So geography, which was often an ally of minorities, is no longer an option here. And of course, it's also the awareness of the outside world and the openness of that world. Meaning in the past, you lived in a region, it was not easy to escape from it. Today, there are simply more options out there. There are opportunities. There's a life out there in the West that calls upon you, that gives you also an example of what it means to live as a normal human being that is respected, that is treated equally in those countries. So I think it's both the push factors and the pull factors there. When we talk about the states and the non-states, I think we have four categories here of states in the region. There are simply places where there is no state any longer. I'm thinking Libya, Lebanon is dysfunctional completely as a state. In those places, you are at the mercy of the armed groups, the insurgents, or the terrorist organizations that are operating there. And then we have the category of the states that are indifferent to their populations. Egypt comes to mind, Iraq as a country that do not do what is necessary to protect those communities and to make them feel safe. We have also can we call them the tolerant states? I'm thinking of the UAE as an example, states that are willing to treat Christians, to provide Christians with opportunities, that do not discriminate against them. And then we have the states that perhaps, despite not having or not thought of as part of the Arab Middle East or not having Christian communities in them, play a negative role in their neighboring countries. I'm thinking here of the role that Qatar plays through its sponsorship of the Muslim Brotherhood, that Iran through its militias across the region, and that Turkey also through its support for the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi or Jihadi groups in the region. Those countries, whether it is by sponsoring those organizations financially or providing them with material support, or even the TV channels that are operating from Qatar and from Turkey, in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, constantly incite against Christians in the region, laying the ground for then the attacks that take place.
Well, thank you, Sam. That was a lot of information and very insightful. And Nadine, I'm going to go to you. You travel extensively in the Middle East and work with Christian and other faith communities, especially in Syria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon. Can you describe what hardships they endure and the challenges they face? How do these challenges cause diminishing their populations?
Well, first, I want to thank you to ADL and to this great panel. Already inspired. I always learn so much from Sam and all of you. So thank you for having me. Religious freedom is more than being able to attend a house of worship. And people can certainly do that in Iraq and Syria. But it's really the ability to be treated as an equal citizen, to have the same human dignity as others in your community. And in Iraq and Syria in particular, Christians are marginalized, harassed, and many still experiencing persecution and violence. And this is why so many continue to leave, with the numbers dropping to precariously low numbers at this point in time. So some of the oldest Christian communities in the world, those in the Nineveh Plains in Iraq, in the Khabur Valley in Syria, have been targeted by, of course, by genocide, by ISIS. So many that did return are now facing other threats that are causing them to leave again. So in Iraq, as Sam had mentioned, we have the Iranian-backed militias, particularly the Babylon Brigade, now broadening to become the Babylon Movement. led by U.S. sanctioned Ryan Kaldani. He has taken power over much of the region, threatening the Christians that remain in the villages and the Christian leaders. I was in the Nineveh Plains in October visiting this community, and there had been a fire at a wedding in Hamdaniya where over 130 Christians lost their lives, over 250 were injured. And, checkpoints couldn't even get through the Iranian militia checkpoints. I mean, ambulances could not even get through the checkpoints to get to the victims. In this community, it had a protest against Kildani just a month before this happened. Kildani and the Babylon movement has also hijacked all the Christian seats in the Iraqi parliament, removing the opportunity for Christians to be a part of their own governance and have any say in the political environment. And of course, Ryan Kildani also, as you know, put pressure on the Iraqi president that ended up pulling back a special status for Chaldean Patriarch Louis Sacco, who oversees the Christian endowments for Iraq, and he fled to, or BLI was actually able to see him a few days after he got there. And I hope that's being addressed. And on top of that, in Iraq, Turkey continues to bomb in their campaign against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, but in Assyrian villages all across the border, causing people to flee with no compensation, no way of making a living other than the farms they have. And of course, recently a Supreme Court decision revoked minority seats, even in the Kurdistan Regional Government Parliament. So even Christians in the Kurdistan region don't have representation anymore, even though Kurdistan, of course, has been a very welcoming place for Christians and other minorities. In northeast Syria, Turkey continues to attack civilian infrastructure. In fact, if you look at a map of the strikes from last year, and then you look at a map of all the religious minorities historically in northeast Syria, and you overlap them, they're exactly the same. So it's really heartbreaking to see all these traditional Christian areas being targeted by Turkey without electricity, without water. And in the Khabur Valley, with some of the oldest Christian communities in the world, they're shelled almost daily. And since Turkey has invaded, the northeast Syria has built 3 dams since 2019. So there's hardly any water in the Khabur, making it very difficult for those Christians that do make a living with farming to be able to stay. According to USERV's annual report that they just released on May 1st, so Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the HTS in Idlib, and the Turkish-backed militias in the areas like Afrin that they've invaded and occupy have the most severe violations of religious freedom in Syria. In fact, most Christians have already left those areas, and the ones that have stayed have been subject to all sorts of horrific violence, including rape, kidnapping, torture. I spoke with an elderly Christian man who had been arrested for being a convert, even though he had converted decades before and endured torture in a Turkish prison. And of course, this entire chaos in both Iraq and in Syria has allowed ISIS and other Islamist groups to rise again and again become a threat to Christians, Yazidis, and other minorities. And of course, to look at Christians in the Assad regime area, they may seem to be protected compared to these other areas, but they're hostages. So the way it works is churches and parishioners must strongly support Assad, or their young men, actually men between 18 and 42, will be conscripted into the military. So I certainly understand the shoes they walk in, and no one judges them for having to stay aligned with Assad. Christians in Lebanon, of course, continue to struggle with being in a failed state without a president. And of course, the president's supposed to be a Christian. So they're missing the opportunity again to speak into their own governance, and they're continuing to leave. So these areas are continue to be difficult places for Christians to be able to stay and feed their families. I've been a part of some organizations that do help them start businesses, have livelihood projects, because I do believe that, as I mentioned, it's not enough to be able to practice your faith. You have to be able to be able to feed your families in order for you to be able to stay.
Thank you very much, Nadine. This is a small overview of the current challenges that the Christians face. And Sam mentioned some of the historic, and there's a lot to unpack here. And of course, there's always new challenges, and minorities, specifically Christians, are affected by it. I turn to Johnnie, and I ask you about, the world has changed dramatically after October 7. So, Johnnie, let me first ask you, how are the Christian communities affected by rising extremism targeting non-Muslims across the Middle East? Can you also tell us about the challenges that the Christian community of Gaza is facing right now?
So I'll start with the first question. What we've seen since October 7th, really since October 8th, is we've seen a emboldened and resurgent Islamist movement around the world, and also various other types of extremists. And so it was a sort of almost a propaganda victory for many of these extremists. And so the vision of an organization like ISIS, for instance, which seemed to have been destroyed. You know, this was a terrible blip in our recent memory, but something of the past. We're actually seeing the resurgence of these extremist ideas, and whether they are the sort of sophisticated actions of Muslim Brotherhood affiliated political organizations, or whether they are the more like the worst forms of extremism that we saw, violent extremism from groups like ISIS. It is all growing, and it is all growing all over the world. And sometimes it's a slow boil, and sometimes it's exploding. And when I say all over the world, I mean all over the world. There's so much of it going on. We're having a hard time keeping track of it. But it seems like these emboldened actors feel like they can get away with things that they didn't feel like they could get away with, before October 7th. And so in Pakistan, we've seen more situations of incarceration of Christians. In not only in Nigeria, but in all of the lake region, the Sahel, in that part of Africa. We've had now a decade of a massive movement targeting principally the Christian minority in Nigeria, but in the surrounding countries. We've seen all of that uptick. So there've been more churches burned, more people killed. A lot of the tactics that Hamas appropriated on October 7th are now being duplicated in other hotspots around the world. I mean, the worst tactics that Hamas used on October 7th are being duplicated, targeting children, targeting women. It's not just enough to attack them. They have to attack them in a way that maximizes the impact of terror. We're seeing it in Europe. You know, there have been a number of attacks on churches. Some of them have been widely publicized. Some of them have received less attention. There have been threats to churches that have been foiled by security forces across the European continent. There are a lot of things that were tried that haven't succeeded. There will probably be more lone wolf type attacks attempted. So basically, anywhere in the world where we've seen these issues in the past, they're growing, and even among countries that were on slightly better behavior, it seems like in an attempt to manage their own extremist elements, they're reverting back to a form of political Islam, which tends to almost immediately start discriminating against minorities, including the Christian minority. We saw another church in Turkey that was turned into a mosque recently, for instance. We've seen attacks like in Egypt, where we've probably seen more attacks on the Christian community in Egypt than we've seen since the Muslim Brotherhood's brief era in Egypt after the Arab Spring. So there's just like stuff everywhere in every direction. When it comes to the Christian community in Gaza, they're just in the worst. They're in the worst position of almost any Christian community in the world. Like in Bethlehem, in Gaza, you once had many Christians actually, and with the unfortunately in Bethlehem, we've seen almost 70% of the, I think it's something like 70% of the Christian community diminished. And in Gaza, there were a handful of Christians that were holding on in the few hundreds, and they're just in an impossible situation, because if they sort of put their head up, if they depart one iota, one phrase from the sort of official line, They face greater suffering, so they're sort of like, you don't know what they actually believe, but they are suffering, and they're caught in the middle, and that is very often the situation when these pop up. I pray for a lot for the Christians in Gaza, across the whole region, but we are seeing a very alarming, very global resurgence in Christian persecution or increased vulnerability of Christian communities literally all over the world, and it's taking on a dozen different forms, whether it's emboldened discrimination in Pakistan, whether it's terrorist attacks in Nigeria, whether it's the almost complete marginalization, in other places around the world. And even on our own campuses in the United States, some of the rhetoric is an anti-Christian, anti-Judeo-Christian rhetoric, for the so-called red-green alliance that we see a lot in Europe is sort of moving into the United States and Canada as well. And it is, by its nature, an anti-Judeo-Christian narrative. So it's a hugely alarming time. It's as alarming as I've seen in at least the last 10 years. And it seems like people aren't really paying attention to it at all.
Well, thank you, Johnnie, for your insightful answer. Sam, I want to go back to you. Could you tell us more about how extremism in the Middle East and the supremacist discourse endanger the lives of Christians?
Certainly. I think when we attempt to understand the challenge that this discourse, you've named it supremacist, and I think this is a word that's accurate in describing that discourse in the region, and to frame it in terms also that, in a sense, Westerners could relate to it, understand. I think if we want to understand how it's impacting the community, we should go back and look how it impacted other communities that used to live in the region. I see a lot of talk today about the Middle East, that the Middle East was a haven for minorities, that they lived happily ever after before the establishment of the State of Israel. It's important to look at the reality to understand how the Jews were impacted and what's happening to the Christians today. Of course, people lived in the region as zimmis, as second-class subjects, not even citizens. They had no equal rights in the first place. They weren't citizens of the Ummah, the nation, at that point in time. But even under modern times, when nationalism emerged in the region and that discourse associated with it, it was completely exclusive, meaning that nationalism, identity, was treated like a hat. You had to belong to that one nation, first an Arab, today a Muslim, and deny your own identity, deny everything associated with you. And the way that discourse worked was first by identifying those people who did not belong to the dominant identity as outsiders, as they don't belong to us, they're others. It was by kicking them out. We saw how during the 40s and early 50s, even a bit in the 60s, the Middle East lost more than 800,000 Jews that had lived for centuries there. It was also about not just kicking the physical people, but wiping out their past. All the contributions of Jews who lived in the Middle East is wiped out. All their history, the physical buildings, the synagogues destroyed. That's the exact same pattern we're seeing today with Christians. When you try to suppress the Syriac identity, Assyrian, or the Coptic identity in Egypt, you're basically playing from the same playbook. You're repeating the same process. When there's a problem today in building churches, and churches are being attacked, or an attempt to build a church results in an attack on the community, as we saw in Egypt about 2 weeks ago, that's about dominating not just the identity of the nation, but the physical presence of that nation. So when we look at this exclusive discourse, and we see it in the form of denying the Christian past and contribution to the region. Coptic history is not taught in Egypt. We have a lovely way of dealing with Egyptian history. There are the pharaohs, Alexander the Great comes, the Romans, and then nothing basically happens until suddenly 300 years after the Arabs and Muslims come. The fact that Egypt was a Coptic country, that this language, this culture, this everything is completely wiped out. It's wiped out from the media. Where's the presence of the Christians of the Middle East in the Arabic-speaking media? Where's the mention about their culture, about their history? But most of the basic things about Christianity are simply completely unknown to those people that live amongst them, to the majority population. So this exclusive discourse attempts to basically create a region that is completely of one type and one color, that denies any diversity, this multitude of cultures and languages and identities that had been there for centuries, and that whether in its form that completely attempts to wipe out the Christians, like ISIS does by simply killing them, or if it's one of the more tolerant groups, the Muslim Brotherhood types, that simply wants to relegate them to a second class, to a zimmitude once again. It's a discourse that does not allow any diversity in the region at all, and is, of course, the main driver for Christians to abandon the region and to seek opportunity elsewhere.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. And I want to emphasize something you've said, and it's about Egypt, but also about most of the Levant, that the Christian communities are indigenous to this land. They were the indigenous people before the Islam came to these territories. So it's very important for our listeners to understand these facts, as well as the Jewish population of these areas. So we're not talking about people that came afterwards. Actually, Islam came after Christianity and Judaism to these lands. So it's important to emphasize this and understand this. And Nadine, you've touched on the challenges, but I want to go more in depth about people who are living in conflict zone and the impact on these Christian communities, like the challenges in work and life. How does such condition undermine their safety, security, livelihood, everything that associated with existing in their ancestral land?
Well, in places like Iraq and Syria and other failed or failing states like Yemen and Libya, during these wars and conflicts, and now we're seeing it in Sudan as well, Christians often pay the biggest price, and Yazidis, other minorities that are treated as if they have less status than others. So what we're seeing is some horrific crimes that are really hidden among all of the violations happening in a country. And so the chaos, as I mentioned earlier, also that happens in a war zone, it gives cover to a lot of extremist groups to be able to commit atrocities against Christian communities with very little attention because of all of the conflict happening all around them. So these become very difficult places for Christians to be able to stay. And oftentimes we will see them risk their lives to leave, as getting in boats to try to make it to Europe, to seeing that these atrocities will continue if they stay. Really dangerous places for Christians to stay right now in these really disturbing conditions.
Thank you very much, Nadine. So we've talked about the problems, and there's a lot of problems and challenges. I want us to discuss now how to improve living conditions and how to reverse this pattern of exodus of Christians, if we can, of course.
So we are seeing a massive decline in the Christian community throughout the Middle East. And I think sometimes we forget that Christianity is actually a Middle Eastern religion. Okay, it's not an American religion. It's not a European religion. It came from the Middle East. It is indigenous to the Middle East, and even in the Arabian Peninsula, one of the sort of first advisors to the Prophet Muhammad was a Christian monk. There's a lot in the Quran about the coexistence of the Christian and Islamic communities in the early era of Islam. In fact, Islam, by the way, itself was saved perhaps entirely by a Christian king. You know, there was an early persecution of Muslims on the Arabian Peninsula, and it was the Christian king in Ethiopia who took in those beleaguered Muslims to protect them. You know, at the beginning of the growth of Islam, even in its cradle. And so this is really a shock on so many levels, because it's not just that the Christian community is declining; it's that the Christian community is being kicked out of its home, and sometimes that's emerges in places like Iraq, when ISIS was at its height, by confiscating land, by murdering people in grotesque ways. More often than not, though, it's just Christians just getting tired, and so they leave and they immigrate, you know, to other countries, so they just don't have to deal with it anymore. I think people, by the way, would be surprised that the only country in the Middle East that has actually had an increase in its Christian population last year, and this has been consistent in the last couple of years, was actually Israel. Israel was the only country that had an increase in its Christian population. And in terms of how to address it, it's not going to happen by accident. It has to happen with intentionality, and there are still positive trends, you know, in the region. I mean, I would say that a lot of the reform movements in the moderate countries are holding on. You know, it's a very good life to be a Christian in the United Arab Emirates, you know, or in the kingdom of Bahrain. In the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there are no churches in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but Christians have basically, and by the way, there are, you know, more than 1 million of them, largely expatriates, Filipinos, and a lot of Catholics and evangelicals are now basically left to worship in their homes without any disturbance. That's not good enough, but that's once absolutely unfathomable. So there are good trends, you know, even in the Islamic world, in the Middle East. But when you sit down and you talk to Christians, they feel very, very often in other countries in that part of the world, and in many circumstances, many countries, they feel like outsiders. They don't feel like they're being treated as a foundation stone of this great, you know, religious hierarchy or tradition. They don't feel like a leg to the Abrahamic stool, you know, that includes Judaism and Christianity and Islam. They feel like they are outsiders in their own historic places, and the governments need to make sure that that's addressed, and that should be addressed obviously in obvious ways when it comes to the laws and when it comes to equal rights under the law and all of these things. But they should be treated, they should be given deferential treatment, and they should not be subject to demi systems, you know, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And unfortunately, that's become the common, you know, sort of situation. In countries like Syria, for instance, where you once had lots of Christians. I mean, you know, the situation now is, yeah, you know, you can be a Christian, you can exist in Syria, but you have to sort of pay homage to the you know, to the political leadership, or else, you know, your life is going to be torturous. And so, you know, very, very often the Christians that have persisted are Christians that have defaulted to a worst moment in history where existence required self-subjugation. You know, just comply with the system, just go along to get along. And that's not the way it should be.
Sam, tell us about what the government can do better to protect their Christian populations.
Definitely. I think there's so much to be done there because of the size of the problem. But I think there are 3 key areas that we should expect, or we should pressure these governments to work on in order to elevate the situation of the Christians in the region. The first is education. I don't think today, in the year 2024, we should have a situation where people living in a country know absolutely nothing about their very neighbors, about people that existed there for thousands of years, about world religion and world civilization, not even the local one. This isolation, this barriers that are put on the minds of young people in the region are a serious problem. Because if people don't think that Christians are indigenous to the region, they don't think they belong, if they're not taught about equality, about tolerance, then it is only natural when they grow up that they will blow these churches up. That's the natural outcome. Those regimes might claim to be protecting the Christians, or that they themselves are not against Christianity, but it's their very action by creating this complete wipeout of Christian and other religious and ethnic minorities' role in the region, that they create they lay the groundwork for these terrorist groups to come and pick things up and move forward. And that again goes to also ethnic groups. I mean, how are Kurds, for example, viewed by the Arabic educational system? How are they portrayed in it? What role does this play in the relationship between Arabic speakers and Kurds? The second area, I think, is legal. What Christians in the Middle East are looking for is not a special status. We don't want to be treated better than others. We don't want to be accorded some special rights. We're simply looking for equality. And equality is what we should expect from the modern nation state and from the legal system. When attacks take place against Christians, we expect that people are punished for it. The fact that there are over 1,000 mob attacks against Copts in Egypt in the last several decades, and not a single person, not a single one, has ever spent a day in jail for that, that's a problem. It means the legal system is not working. The fact that the Egyptian state does not refer these cases to the courts in the first place is an indication of the problem. The fact that there are discriminatory laws in the books of all these Arab countries that discriminate against these Christians should not be tolerated. The fact that I, as a Christian, will get double what my sister would inherit from our parents simply because Islamic Sharia is implemented on us in Egypt in terms of inheritance should not be something accepted. So there are these things that should be done on the legal front in order to create a system of equality for all of the region's citizens. The third category is, I think, protection from the violent attacks. Now, terrorist attacks take place everywhere. No regime is expected to completely be able to stop them. But it tells us something. When the Christians in a village in Egypt, just like it happened in El Fawakir village 2 weeks ago, know in advance, they know 4 days in advance that we are going to be attacked in 4 days. And they go to the police station and they inform the authorities and nothing happens. And the authorities only come after the attack takes place. That's a regime that is not willing to protect its citizens. That's a regime that is sending a message to the attackers that it's okay, it's fine, have your fun, and then we'll come and we won't punish anyone for that attack. So it's that 3 levels. But if I may add something else about other governments, and that's the US government in that regard, if that is the role of the regional governments, I think there is both an opportunity and a role for the US to play here. First, in terms of aid, the people who worked on Iraq and Syria have spoken for years about the problem of aid not reaching the most vulnerable communities, especially the Christian communities, being monopolized by the Iraqi government and so on. That issue was addressed in the Trump administration, but it's an issue about the overall approach of the US in the region. In the aid to Egypt, for example, are Christians getting anything out of this aid? The US provides thousands of opportunities for Egyptian military officers to come and receive military training in the US. how many Christians are sent by the Egyptian military to receive that training? Do we care at all about it? So the way we look at aid, not targeting countries, but targeting communities, I think is something to think about. The second thing I would say is the US has a role in addressing the outside players that impact the Christian communities in the region, whether it is the allies, in this case, Qatar or Turkey or supposed allies, in addressing the incitement that comes from these countries. I mean, just to give an example, not even about Christianity, the main analyst, military analyst on Al Jazeera, Faiz al-Duweri, tweeted 2 days ago about the Jews and their nature and what they do. It's a purely anti-Semitic tweet. There's no way to frame it anything else about Zionists or any other people. It's about the Jews and the Jewish nature. That's coming from Qatar. That's a man that has a platform through a regime that's supposedly our ally. The same goes for Turkey for their channels there, and also how to address the Iranian militias and the threat that they play in the region. I think in those two areas, the US can play a very important role in helping the Christians of the region.
Thank you, Sam. Very important information. And I want to add one thing. Like, for instance, my native country of Syria, in the constitution, the president should be Muslim. And that's one of the absurdity of one of the countries that claim to be secular and enshrine in its constitution that part of its indigenous population that are Christians or any other faith cannot be president. And I think that you touched a very important subject about the US government policy. And I think the issue about Christians in the Middle East shouldn't be a partisan issue. It should be addressed by two, because it's not a religious issue, it's a human rights issue. And that both parties should be advocating for the rights of Christians and other minorities in the Middle East on basis of human rights issues. So thank you very much for this. Nadine, I'm going to go to you, and if you can tell us about the positive developments in the Middle East toward Christian. I don't know if there is some, maybe there is some bright spot, but how can we build an inclusive and democratic societies that foster minorities, including Christians, in the Middle East?
Well, the work I do as president of the Secretariat is we convene the roundtable here in Washington, D.C., but also in about 30 countries globally, including in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. And they're such impactful places where multi-faith communities standing for each other and with each other against persecution and trying to improve laws, work together to educate their communities. I think working to build religious freedom is as important, if not more important, than even calling out the atrocities that are happening. And really that's where most of my focus has been. I do think it's important that we do stand with those that are doing the right thing, that are working towards positive conditions, and no government is perfect. So, no one's suggesting that's the case. But of course, in the northern Iraq, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, the Kurdistan regional government did open their doors to take 1 million Christians, Yazidis, and others fleeing ISIS and the Syrian civil war. And they have created a pluralistic environment. Even the Baha'is, who are outlawed in Iraq, are allowed and live peacefully and practice their faith in northern Iraq. But of course, the Iraqi government and other governments are threatening their autonomy. And that could have a huge impact on stability for the region. And of course, in Northeast Syria, the Democratic Autonomous Administration in Northeast Syria was built just undercover with hardly anyone paying attention. As they were defeating the ISIS caliphate, they were empowering local communities to build this self-governance, like in places like Raqqa, where half the leaders are women, and they overrepresent minorities. So throughout the government, it looks like, I went through and did a deep dive in 4 of the regions, and I was listing all the co-chairs and vice co-chairs of all the committees, and I realized that they all had different ethnicities and religions. So they had co-chairs and vice co-chairs, men and women, and all different ethnicities and religions. And so you'd have Syriac, Assyrian, Chaldean Christians, Armenian Christians, Christian converts, Yazidis, Turkmen, Alawites, of course, Muslims, Kurds, both Arabs, and all sitting at a table together, solving their own problems for their own communities. And so they have even have churches of Christian converts where members are mostly treated as equal members of society. Really done something really stunning there. And because Turkey equates them as being part of the Kurdistan, the Workers' Party, the PKK, has continued to attack them, has invaded several times. And the places they invaded that used to have religious freedom now, some of them have conditions similar to the ISIS caliphate, and the world looks away because it's so difficult to know how to deal with Turkey. Erdogan has announced he plans to invade again this summer, and I understand he's met with Iran and is waiting for a green light from Iran. The question we need to ask and the US needs to ask is, what will Erdogan promise Iran for a green light? Is the plan to destroy this autonomous administration in North and East Syria and replace it? Would Turkey take the top half and fill it with Islamist militias, just like they have done in the other areas that they've invaded, and give the bottom half to Iran for a land bridge that could this way reach Lebanon and Israel? It's hard to know what the plan would be, but we know that the US government needs to make the cost too high for Turkey to continue attacking really both in northern Iraq and in northeast Syria. And of course, even the Inspector General of the United States put out reports each quarter about the giving insight into things that aren't working for the DoD. And one of the big things they have said constantly is Turkey's actions have disrupted the coalition's fight against ISIS. So as ISIS rises again with this chaos, we have these two governments that the US supports the Kurdistan regional government, but still has been disappointing taken a backseat in so many ways with them recently when it came to the fights that they've had for getting budget from Iraq and other things. And then of course you have Northeast Syria where the US has in the last couple of years interacted with them more. They've lifted sanctions on Northeast Syria. They do have a relationship now where they used to not have a relationship with the government, only with the military, the Syrian Democratic Forces, but still there's that fear because of Turkey. And as expected, religious minorities have paid the biggest price. And so, I think US government policy should be to support, these governments don't need government building. They don't need tons of money. What they need is for the US to draw some lines, to give them the space to continue to build governance that protects religious minorities, that are pluralistic societies. In fact, there's a lot we can learn from both of them on how to do that in fragile areas. And it's important that instead of just being against the bad actors, that we stand with the ones that are really trying their best to provide areas for minorities to live.
Thank you, Nadine. So in brief, there is an issue of, and I've heard it from a lot of people in the region, of consistency in the policy of the United States. Did you feel that element also being complained about by a lot of people in that region, especially minorities?
Absolutely. Perfect example is, when President Trump announced, I think it was 50 million to the minorities after the Turkish invasion. And most people presumed the Christians would get that. I went to Syria and everyone's mad at the Christians for getting 50 million from the US, and the Christians are saying, when are we getting money from the US? I mean, no one saw the money is the point. And I was just told by a Syrian lobbyist a couple of days ago presenting at our roundtable that some 6% of the aid that has gone to minorities from the US has made it to the minorities. So US policy, it's interesting because when I meet with people, I always in the government, they seem to be aligned with me in terms of wishing that these were the ways the US stood with these governments. But as we know, getting US policy to adjust by 1 degree is like moving a ship. It's a very hard thing to do. And they really do need pressure. I always say it's not an us against them thing. For all the advocacy I did about Northeast Syria in particular, I'd go into the State Department, they would be so warm and they'd thank me for my advocacy. There was never any anger about the work I was doing. And even now, when I come and go from the region, I'm always welcomed by the US government and have a really warm relationship with them. This is not us and them. This is just the way bureaucracies work, and they need pressure. And that's why it's so important that people that care about these religious minorities in all of these countries, in Egypt and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, of course, in these failed states or failing states, that we try to be loud and get Congress to speak out and provide some pressure to the US government, to the administration. It actually helps them to be able to go back to these countries and say, hey, I'm getting pressure. We've got to, or to go, for their own policy experts to say, guys, we need to adjust to match this. I mean, they need pressure to prioritize these things because they're always dealing with all these fires all over the world. And, this discussion is a perfect opportunity for us to remind these policymakers of the importance of these communities and how some small policy changes could have real impact on the lives of these minorities in these countries.
Thank you, Nadine. Very insightful, and it's important for our listeners to understand how they could help in changing policies in the U.S. that can affect indigenous communities and minorities in the Middle East. I'm going to go to Johnnie, to another bright spot that happened in the Middle East, and I want to talk about the Abrahamic Accord. How it may improve the living condition for all faces in the Middle East, and its effects actually of the Abrahamic Accord since its signing.
The situation that we're witnessing now, the war between the state of Israel and Hamas, which is the single most significant event when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a generation and a half. Okay, this was truly a black swan event, and a black swan event of this type in that region involving these parties. The conventional wisdom was it was going to shatter, the norms of peace, and it was going to inflame the Arab Street, and a full regional sort of repositioning, had to take place in a circumstance like this. And actually, despite all the activism, despite all the tensions among all these countries, all the complex geopolitical dynamics, what we have actually found is that the peace treaty between Israel and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is fine. The peace treaty between the state of Israel and Egypt is fine. The Abraham Accords have held fine, and even in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, obviously, which doesn't have a normalization with the state of Israel, the leaders of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are all still talking about the prospect of normalization with Israel, and in fact, if history is any indication, very, very often it's in the aftermath of one of these black swan events, that we do end up with a new moment of peace. And so I think the Abraham Accords, which were by their nature addressing the religious dynamic in the region, that's why they're called the Abraham Accords. And actually, kind of what we're seeing now is we're seeing in stark relief two different sort of peace lessons. The Oslo Accords, which transparently chose, this is not an opinion, it's the negotiators of the Oslo Accords intentionally chose to leave the religious issues out of the negotiation. It was a secular political agreement, and that's what it was meant to be, and the religious issues were to be addressed later on. And Hamas and other terrorist organizations took advantage of that vacuum to sort of religionize the conflict, and that has persisted till today. Compared to the Abraham Accords, which saw a moderate, tolerant future of coexistence, and it was built into it from the very beginning. And so I really resonate with a statement I heard from the president of Israel just a couple of days ago, where he said, the region is in a time of war, but it is still in an era of peace. And I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from the Abraham Accords about the future. One lesson of the Abraham Accords, though, that I think is being made apparent to everyone is the Abraham Accords were not meant to be a replacement for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And because of the relationship between Israel and the UAE, as an example, there's an immense amount of aid, going into Gaza that would not be going into Gaza had it not been for the Abraham Accords. There are all kinds of these other dynamics that are going on. There's a land bridge right now that's basically you can get food from and other natural resources and commodities from India through the UAE via truck through Saudi Arabia, through Jordan, straight into Israel. Like, these are all byproducts of the Abraham Accords. So It is a time of war. It is an era of peace. I think we have to believe that the future doesn't rest with the tower that we're seeing now, but it rests in the strength of the peace that is surrounding all of this. And I am scared to think what the situation might have been like had the peacemaking work not been done. In the end, however, these terrorists are enemies of all of those countries. They're enemies of humanity itself. Hamas does not represent the aspirations of the Palestinian people. In fact, they more than perhaps anyone in history have used a people as a human shield in order to advance their political agenda. But for all of us who love peace, and as a Christian, my text says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." They're the ones that will be called the children of God. We have to pursue peace, and I think in the end, peace will win. There's a powerful verse I think about a lot in days like these, and it's in the book of Romans. It's the letter of the Apostle Paul to the church in Rome, a persecuted church, by the way. And he says at the very, very end of the letter, he says, "Soon the God of peace will crush Satan underneath our feet." And that the terror that we saw on October 7th was as satanic, as demonic, as inhumane as anything I think any of us have seen. But I believe that peace will ultimately prevail. But we have to, I'm a religious person, we have to pray like everything depends upon God, and we have to work like everything depends upon us.
In conclusion, I would like to thank our speakers once more for taking their valuable time to be with us and for sharing their expertise. And I want to say something. I'm actually an Arab Muslim, and I was brought up in a society that didn't understand the grievances of minorities and different communities, specifically Christians in our community. And such discussions that we're having today, it's very important for our Muslim viewers as well. We need to understand what other communities amongst our society feel. What's the challenges they have? If anyone in any country in the Middle East has an aspiration to improve their countries, and the majority population, which is Muslim like me, wants to improve their countries, I think it's our duty and it's our obligation to listen and to understand the minority communities and these indigenous communities, to understand their challenges, their historic and their current, so we can together improve our society. It's beneficial to the Muslim community as much as it's beneficial to Christian communities and other ethnic communities like Kurds and others. This is very important for us to understand, and very important for us to all together to move forward to a better future for countries in the Middle East. Thank you very much for listening to us and being patient with us.
At this time, our webinar is finished. I would like to thank all of our presenters, Sam, Nadine, Johnnie, for a brilliant discussion, and Shadi, of course, for leading this discussion. Please stay tuned for updates from ADL and ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities, and please subscribe to ADL's YouTube channel and feel free to share our content. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.